Good evening. Thank you for waiting a little bit. We're going to kick off. My name's Lewis Blackwell. I'm chairing this evening. I'm the curator of SuperMaterial upstairs, and I'm the strategy and development director of the Built Environment Trust, which is the organization behind the exhibition and behind the program and behind the building center. So thank you very much for coming to this session. The air we breathe, an exploration of how radical materials and building techniques can combat pollution. Pretty important issue. Now, I have a slight change of maybe when some of you booked, you may notice that Alison Dring was going to come over, who's connected with one of the projects upstairs and works for a company called Made of Air, based in Berlin. Unfortunately, Alison had a family situation that meant she couldn't come, but we do have another speaker, and rather sort of serendipity, in fact, that didn't realize that Bill Watts, senior partner at Max Fordham, is in fact quite connected with one of the projects upstairs, the one that involves the concrete with the mosses on and things. And I think Bill will talk about that project and talk generally about some of the research and development he's been doing in this area. So let me say a little bit about, in fact, I think I'll say a bit about the three speakers as we go along, but perhaps a little bit of background to why today's topic is a pretty important topic. I think some of you will have, doubtless sort of seen the headlines that, by January the 5th, London had already breached its annual air pollution limit. And of course, we know air pollution is connected with many really, pretty terrible diseases. It's estimated that nitrous oxide emissions cause about 6,000 early deaths each year in the capital alone. So that's pretty terrible stuff. Sadiq Khan has pledged, apparently, I understand, 875 million to tackling the problem over 5 years. I don't know whether that's going to sort the problem in 5 years, or that's just what he's going to spread across the 5 years of spend. But what are we going to do with that? And perhaps we'll learn some principles and priorities from this evening's discussion with our speakers, because there are things we can do using materials to combat the problem, or maybe to help remove the problem from happening in the first place. And there are materials out there, products out there that are already doing certain things. And I was surprised when we put an exhibition together how many interesting things are out there, but how little adoption there has been in what would often seem very straightforward, why don't you use this? But things are actually much more complicated often than they look, and we'll hear a bit about that, I think, this evening. So what we're going to do, we have speakers each give an address. The first two have some slides. Bill doesn't have slides. And then we'll take to the panel, and we'll have a broad-ranging discussion, and you're very welcome to bring all your questions forward then. I think we'll take questions at that point rather than along the way, so that we can bring in each of the speakers on any relevant question at that point. A couple of things I should probably attend to. Just to remind you, there is another talk next week, our last talk in the series, From Labs to Prefabs. We have interesting speakers there, talking about how materials are changing the way we build cities and other aspects. So have a look at that online if you want to get more information about that. It's next Wednesday, same time, same place. Now, what else do we should talk about? I should thank Trimo, by the way. Once again, Trimo sponsoring this session, sponsoring the whole event program. That's how the tickets can be available free. So very big thanks to Trimo. I want to make a little comment about, you might have noticed on your seat, the nighttime is the right time competition. And if you're at all interested in how 24-hour cities can work, and you've got some thoughts on that subject, still not too late to get your entries into that competition. And we've actually extended the deadline, so we have 1 more week to get, and an entry could simply be an idea on a sheet of paper. I mean, it can be that simple. Maybe if you've got such a succinct idea. Otherwise, you might want something more substantial, or you may indeed have done a project in the past that is relevant to the theme of the competition. So please do look at that and consider entering. It's going to be a really interesting exhibition, and a range of talks around that coming up in late May through June. Amy Lamé, one of the architects from BIG, various other people on the judging panel of that competition, so it should be good. Now, our first speaker tonight. Charles Haswell. Charles has just told me that I've got his bio slightly wrong. He's got a fascinating bio, and he's had like 3 careers. He is currently senior advisor to Cambridge Nanosystems. Before that, he was working with graphene stone. He's going to talk about some of the things that graphene stones products are doing for us. So he's worked on the largest anaerobic digestion project in England. His background, his previous career before getting into this area, was actually involving, I'm not sure which order this went in, but he was a diplomat for 25 years, specializing in China. That was one phase of the career. Another phase, he worked in finance. I think possibly that was before that, but Charlie will explain. He worked for the Royal Bank of Scotland, don't boo now, and HSBC, boo now maybe. Anyway, so I can see why Charlie no longer works in that area. Great change to a fantastic new focus. So I'm going to hand over to Charlie with his focus on sustainability and new materials. Here we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming along tonight, and good evening and welcome. I should explain, you've also got me as the consultant to the Graphene Company. So I'll just introduce, if I may, my colleagues from the Graphene Company London. This is Patrick, who's the chief executive, and Francisco. They are responsible for graphenstone in this country, and I spent last year working with them. I've moved on now to Cambridge Nanosystems. Every now and again, I'm crossing a bridge in London, and I look up in the sky, and I have this sort of complete double take, because I realize that actually not that far above us, life is untenable. We come out of the atmosphere, and there's no possibility of life. And actually, you can't dig very far into the ground to create a sustainable habitat either. So the actual space that we live in is tiny. If you take the Earth's land mass and take away the oceans, and just imagine the landmass and turn it into a rectangle, it's not very many thousand miles square, and it flies through space a bit like a magic carpet. So it is quite precious. As I say, we can't go very far into the Earth's surface to live, and we don't have to go up very far before we run out of life. So it's an extraordinary object. Sorry, this is going to be a bit slow. We call it home, but it's this little blue thing that floats through nothing. And what's really scary about it is that the layer that actually sustains us is incredibly thin. It's the thickness of that little blue line on the grey disk. That's how much we live in. So this is the air we breathe. What's interesting about the atmosphere is that it hasn't been the same at all. I mean, we talk about climate change. The climate's always changed. I'm not saying that as a climate change skeptic, but the planet has changed enormously during its lifetime. So it's been around for 4.54 billion years. As you can see in the early days, lots of methane, ammonia, quite a lot of hydrogen, a lot of helium, surprisingly quite a lot of water vapor. Then you had this sort of spike in the Archean period of carbon dioxide. So there have been periods in the past when there was a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But actually what's interesting about that is that gave rise to the things that lived off carbon dioxide, the plants, and started to generate oxygen. And it's oxygen that enables us to live. And as you can see from this, the carbon dioxide tails off, and it's, for about 1 billion years, it's actually remarkably constant. The air's made up of things that are familiar, mostly nitrogen, nearly 80% nitrogen. You think we are oxygen life forms, we need an awful lot of oxygen. What's interesting is that much above about 23, 24%, oxygen becomes toxic. It's not good for us. Things oxidize, we take antioxidants because they make us better. But also things combust more easily, so you get quite a dangerous sort of planet. So this balance between nitrogen and oxygen is really quite delicate. And then you've got these other things. As you can see, carbon dioxide is actually not that high, but we know the impact that it has on the atmosphere. The one I'm going to pick out just from this is methane. For those of you not familiar with the chemical formula, and I wasn't until a short while ago, CH4, 1 carbon atom to 4 hydrogen atoms. It's 30 times worse than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. And so the reason that they flare it at oil fields is so that instead of releasing methane into the atmosphere, they release carbon dioxide because it's not quite so damaging. That's not really very good science. So we're doing our best to mess up that balance. A lot of the things that we do are pushing carbon into the atmosphere and making it an awful lot worse. The picture at the top right there, that's the oil sands in Alberta. For anybody familiar with the oil sands in Canada, that's flaring methane. As I say, they're doing that because the carbon dioxide it pushes up into the atmosphere is not as damaging as if they simply released the methane. I mentioned in that earlier slide that you've got a relatively flat level of carbon dioxide. That was a sort of low greeny-yellow band along the bottom. Just recently, it's shot up rather dramatically. I don't know if any of you have seen Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, but he makes quite a lot of that particular graph. I take a view that climate change has actually been happening for a very long time. Glaciers have been receding for a very long time. There are things called Milankovitch Cycles, which some of you might know about. Essentially, the Earth wobbles. Sometimes it leans more towards the sun, sometimes it leans away. Sometimes it rotates closer to the sun, and sometimes it rotates further away. And so the climate has been changing for a long time, but there is good evidence that it's us, with our carbon dioxide, that's beginning to have a real impact. And there is a clear link between global temperature, global warming, and the presence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I mentioned earlier that at a point in the Earth's history, there was a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So nature evolved and became sustainable by making use of that. It devised ways of capturing the carbon and fixing it into structures, into things that were useful, things like trees. And that carbon is fixed for a long time. We take it out as coal, but of course we then start burning it and releasing the carbon again. The byproduct that I mentioned here is actually the byproduct of photosynthesis. It was that generation of oxygen that I talked about earlier that makes complex life forms like us possible. So if we're going to sort this out, we've got to try and find a way of mimicking nature, that ability to take carbon out of the atmosphere and fix it and do something useful with the product. So we need to be able to create stable structures. It'd be useful to have a usable byproduct. Obviously, photosynthesis, the byproduct is oxygen. But the key to all of this is graphene. And I'm sure everyone in this room has heard about graphene, knows a little bit about graphene. Graphene in its pure form is a layer, hexagonal web of carbon atoms, just one atom thick. It was discovered in Manchester, or isolated first in Manchester in 2004. 13 years ago. It is interesting that when carbon fiber was first developed, it took 30 years to turn it into usable things, into composites and so on. So you might ask why it's taken so long to take graphene and put it into usable things. Well, we're beginning to accelerate that process, and I'll come on to that. But graphene has extraordinary properties. So it's transparent, it's inert, it's water repellent. You might have seen a thing in the press about 3 weeks ago about how they've just developed a graphene oxide filter for seawater. So you can literally filter seawater and you get pure drinking water. It's a very effective thermal conductor and a super electrical conductor. It's also 200 times stronger than steel, but it's light, it's flexible, it's hard. If we can really use it in buildings and in the built environment, it is pretty much a perfect material. The first company that actually made graphene available in a commercial form was Graphenstone. And these are coatings which actually took one of the traditional materials, lime, which is breathable, which is natural, but not necessarily terribly strong, and put graphene in it to give it strength. And those have been available in this country for about a year. It was launched about a year ago. And there's a full range of paints and coatings and so on. The point about lime-based paints is that when you put them on the wall, they start reabsorbing the carbon dioxide you cooked out of the lime in the first place. So it actually breathes in carbon dioxide and takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So we're at the beginning of what I call a new age of materials that are intrinsic to a healthy environment. We talked about nitrous oxides earlier. Graphenstone also produced coatings which shield out electromagnetic radiation. Very useful for children's bedrooms, mobile phones and things. But also which actually take nitrous oxides out of the atmosphere through a catalytic process. Now, as we see more and more of these kind of materials, then architects are going to be able to take advantage of all these different things that are available and actually build buildings which get back to my point earlier of helping the atmosphere to recover, helping take the carbon out of the atmosphere. I've mentioned just a few things, but actually, as many of you will know, graphene has an almost infinite number of uses. And here's just a few things that I'll focus on. I've talked about coatings. Paints, there's the company in Canada that's producing coatings to paint on buoys at sea because they don't corrode. You're seeing them beginning to be used in concrete additives, so they bring lightness and strength to concrete. So we'll see ever more fantastic, light, airy structures that are stronger than the previous versions. Fireproofing is quite new. Some of you might know that there's the tallest wooden building in the world is going up in London. It's a 7-story wooden building, but it has to be fireproofed. So Cambridge Nanosystems, which is the company that I'm working with, has actually produced a graphene coating which fireproofs the timber. Composites, polymers, all these things. I should go back for a moment. That lattice you saw of carbon atoms is not necessarily how graphene appears in all its uses. Most graphene is produced in platelets and little particles. But when you mix these particles into polymers or into composites, you get the properties of the graphene coming through in the finished material. So nobody's making an enormous sheet of graphene that could fill this room, for example. That's not possible technologically at the moment. But nor is it necessary because the graphene platelets and graphene particles will have the same properties. But you're seeing, for example, bicycle tires. Vittoria, which is an Italian company, is using graphene in its tires. Some of you may know about carbon black. The carbon black industry in the world is about a $56 billion industry. Carbon black is vital to car tires, rubber hoses, anything that uses rubber. It strengthens it. It's a coloring agent. Graphene is a straight substitute for carbon black, so you're immediately looking at an economically substitutable alternative. So you're immediately looking at an industry for graphene of about $56 billion there. What graphene brings to tires, as well as the strength, is its thermal conductivity. So any of you who follow Formula One will know that Pirelli have been having trouble with their tires. There's quite a spectacular blowout in the bottom right-hand corner there. When Pirelli start putting graphene in their tires, not only will you get the additional strength of the graphene, but you'll get the heat distribution, which has been the main problem. The tires will stop blowing up. When you start using those tires on your vehicles, they will just last an awful lot longer. Now, some of the tire industry might not like that, but that is one of the ways in which we can start to conserve materials. You get sensors. This wrist here, that's actually a sensor for diabetics. So instead of having to test regularly and so on, you can simply wear something on your wrist and the sensors will pick up your blood sugar and tell you when you need to make some adjustments. And some of you may have seen, there was a piece in the Financial Times recently about hydrogen cars. Obviously, there's two schools of thought on this. One is electric vehicles. That's the Elon Musk school of thought, where you have batteries, and battery technology will at some point get better. They will get lighter and they will have longer range. But there's also the hydrogen technology, which is about fuel cells. And the Toyota Mirai, which you can buy, I don't think it's available in this country, but they're manufacturing them in Japan at the moment, has 2 hydrogen tanks and a fuel cell and a backup battery, and it's basically an electrical vehicle. Its exhaust is water. One of the problems around one of the problems around hydrogen as a fuel source is storing it because it leaks through things. One thing it doesn't leak through is graphene. So if you build your hydrogen tanks out of carbon fiber composite using graphene, you can build a safe storage system for hydrogen. It then the technologies run on through, because if you use graphene for the electrodes within the fuel cell, you enormously increase the current capacity of the fuel cell. So you can see how these technologies all continue to reinforce each other. And if you thought that was clever, here comes the clever bit. Some of you may know what a plasma is. I'm not talking about blood plasma, I'm talking about plasma as a material. Plasma is actually the 4th state of matter. So you're familiar with solids, liquids, and gases. And beyond a gas, there is plasma. And what happens in a plasma is that the electrons break free from molecules and from atoms and from molecules. And effectively, you get a soup of ions and electrons. So you can break up gases in a plasma. Now, some of you may know of some of the experiments going on with plasma technology at the moment. So the thing called the Joint European Torus at Culham, which is an attempt to produce fusion power. That runs very hot plasmas they have to be held in place by superconducting magnets. So you have a superconducting magnet which has to be at absolute zero, about a foot from plasma, which is several thousands of degrees hot. So the technology is difficult, very difficult. But there are other ways of producing plasmas. And one is you can use microwaves. And when I say microwaves, I'm talking about the same kind of magnetron as you have in your microwave at home in the kitchen, just a bit more powerful. But you can crack methane using microwaves. And this is what Cambridge Nanosystems has done. This is the technology that they've developed. We'll go back to that point that methane was CH4. So what the microwaves do is take the worst of the greenhouse gases and split it into graphene and hydrogen, which is an energy source. So you get something looking a bit like this. What comes out at the end of this process, you start, as I say, with the worst of the greenhouse gases, and you get graphene as a material, and then hydrogen as your energy source. So we can do this. We can fix the carbon, rather like nature fixed the carbon from carbon dioxide. We can fix the carbon from methane, and then we release hydrogen as a pure energy source. Lots of people talk about the need to cut down on carbon, talk about the low-carbon economy. Carbon is our enemy. Actually, graphene means that carbon is our ally in all of this. In future, we won't talk about low-carbon economies. We'll talk about carbon-efficient economies. So you are seeing the future here. What you're also seeing is the long-term sustainability of the air we breathe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Very interested in getting you maybe to talk a little bit about how more you see that applying to the built environment in sort of specific details. I'm going to move straight on though for our next speaker. Christopher Mccarthy is the director of Battle Mccarthy, an engineering and landscape design consultancy that specializes in sustainable master planning and building engineering. And Christopher has over 30 years' experience in the industry. He's engaged in sustainable city farming. He leads key research and development for incorporating vegetation within environmental facades, as well as looking at how we deal with air, water, and power building engineering infrastructure and building systems. So, where's Christopher? He's over here.
Yes. Is the speaker working? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Next one's picture of carbon.
Okay. Let's go. Done. Thanks very much. Right. It's the subject I'm going to be talking about is living materials, and everything I'm going to talk about you can do at home, or you could do it in a yard, or you could do it in your office. So you don't have to wait for some laboratory out there to solve your problem. Now, the only thing about the living materials is there's a lot of confusion and misinformation. So if I talked about plants cleaning air, and I'm doing a research on leaves, as far as I'm concerned, only leaves clean air. And then if I'm doing one on roots, only roots clean air. So you get all this misinformation. The other thing is there's certain trees that don't do much, and there's a lot of other trees that do a huge amount. And somebody wants to read, so you read about the one that doesn't do anything. So it's, with a group of people in the debate, is trying to demystify the issue and bring it down to the very simple principles and driving it forward. And the issue of using vegetation in cleaning air isn't, of course, we should stop producing emissions, yes. But that's going to take decades. But people are dying today, so we've got to do something pretty quickly. And vegetation can do that. But again, this apparatus is to improve the air. That's where the engineer comes in. What they want to do is get a tree to be 50 trees. But after it's cleaned the air, what else do you do with it? Well, you start eating it. So the technology is there to clean the air first, and once the air is clean, because it will graduate from Croydon first, but Oxford Street last. So as it graduates in, then people could start to eat in the city, which has other benefits. So and it is important to go back. Everything we're talking about is already being done, and as already presented, that there we are. There was no atmosphere, and then vegetation. It took 2 billion years to get to a point to generate the atmosphere we've got now. And over the last once the beginning of bacteria started to grow and then plants. And what was happening is as they were producing more and more oxygen, things could get faster. So there's slow-moving animal in low oxygen, but as you get more oxygen, you get faster, you could run faster, and that changes. Then we came along, started chopping down the trees, and only in 200 years out of 2 billion, we just took out most of it. And of course, we excavate and minerals that have been locked into the crust, and we make them into dust, which then we choke. So it's all understandable, and it's not by surprise where the pollution problems are. And I'm not going to go through the whole issues of air pollution, but there are limits, and these limits that have been set that we must reduce our air pollution to doesn't mean everything's fine. If you don't exceed these limits, like 40 micrograms per meter cube, doesn't mean that you're okay. No, it means that your chances of dying prematurely due to cancer are reduced by 50%. There's still other problems. But to look at the scale of it, so this is the big one, the big subject is the particle matter, which are very small particles, like dust, very small dust, and there's a hair on your head, and there's a hair on your head, and that's a 2.5. And the reason they're concerned is they go into your lungs, into your bloodstream, into your brain, and you get Alzheimer's, dementia, and all these other problems. But the nitrogen dioxide is the other one. So if we went into the Royal Albert Hall, and we said, well, how much pollution can I have? Well, it's the weight of PM 2.5s is the weight of a $1 US note. That's it. And then if you put that amount of PM 2.5s in there, now you're hitting the 40. And the nitrogen dioxide, it's okay, it's $4 US notes. Now, looking at nitrogen, it's very, 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 very small. I mean, on a hair, you've got 600 of them. So you're looking at something so, nitrogen dioxide is very tiddly, and if you concentrate it, it's brown, and that similarly affects human beings by breathing it. Now, if we looked at materials, the most advanced materials of taking out air pollution are those researchers going into masks for cyclists. It's amazing. I mean, so if you want, so I'm not going to give you, I'm not giving you a lecture on this, but if you want to know about these, then just go on the internet for the latest. The only weakness in it is here, because it leaks, and therefore, even though all the work that's been done, it's actually not as effective as you could do, because it's a physical impossibility, unless you stitched it on your face, I suppose. But the other thing is there's some brilliant ideas like nitrogen dioxide, titanium dioxide, which you spray on the road, and that was all, when we had the Olympics. It was happening all around our sniffers. And what happens is the nitrogen dioxide through the titanium dioxide and ultraviolet light then produces NO3, and NO3 is actually plant food. So they were spraying this, but they've discovered some other things that float around in the air when you do this reaction, actually very toxic. So DEFRA now banned it. We can't do this anymore. So we go back to something we feel comfortable about is, yes, of course we should reduce emissions, and the main GLA strategy is about green infrastructure, which is green infrastructure is everything, a road, a roof, a wall, and more of it. We're very lucky because we've already got loads. If we've got 40% of London is green, where Paris is 10% and Dubai is a couple of feet, in comparison. So we're going to be the first city with better air than any other city in the world. The question is, there it is, and all we're trying to do is accelerate it by adding more. If we had obviously more green, and there's no point having green in the green belt because you're breathing the pollution in Oxford Street. You want it right next between the pollution and you. Because at the moment, the only air filters we've got in London are human beings. We're doing a great job, much more than anybody else. And so you've got this addition, but you get to a point that becomes safe, then that vegetation starts, instead of growing ivy that cleans air, it's now growing tomatoes that you can eat. The other thing I always get this, I put it forward, is there is another bit of green, there is trees, but this is as important and more important is lichens and algae and moss. And you see, you know, in the adverts, get out there and start spraying your paving slabs, your walls, and get rid of this green muck. Well, actually, it is more productive than a big oak tree, your roof. And we should protect trees for obvious reasons, but we should protect algae in people's roofs with moss on them. The other thing is you can tell the different air pollution you've got by the difference. Algae takes about 5 years, you know, to grow. It needs water, so it's a very intelligent thing, and it will start to grow and say, well, I'm not happy here because the air pollution's this, and so you get different ones. So this is the smoother the algae. I'm not going to get into a whole on lichens. The smoother the one means the air's the worst. When you actually get very fluffy ones, the air is much better. So people use this to tell what the air pollution is. Now it's mostly aimed at, you know, links to sulfur dioxide, or SO2, but then becomes sulfur dioxide. But that's enough of this one. But the work upstairs, which we follow through, is critically important. We need to protect every bit of ugly, revolting green stuff on paving slabs and on roofs and all that awful moss. Let's get rid of it. You know, you see it in the Sunday papers. Now I'm going to move on to something more understandable, is the tree. Now it's just not about the tree, it's about everything. It's the groups of trees, the tree, the surface of the leaves, the absorption of the leaves, the microbes on the roots, and the roots themselves. It's a whole combination, it's a machine. And there's the big particulate matter, which is the dust, you know, of your tabletop, and then you get the smaller PM10s and the 2.5s, and then you get nitrogen dioxide, which we're particularly focusing at. And they all are taken out by the tree, by the groups of trees. Obviously, you know, the wind has to pass through, and as you go around a corner, things rain, you know, because particles drop out of the sky because the air velocity drops. And then obviously we get the other end of the nitrogen dioxide, which is absorbed. You know, the shape of the tree is not going to make any difference. They just fly through. I mean, you know, so it does affect it. I don't know if I should take you through this diagram. The time's short, but I could, if people do you think I should take you through why? Okay, well, I'll do it very quickly. But what is important that you've got, what I'm trying to do is understand, it's like a game of chess. You know, it's not one piece, it's a number of pieces that makes the game interesting. So if we just did the particulate matter, all we're saying is as the air flows through, it flips around and therefore it rains of the larger particles. Then the structure of the tree, the types of tree, the groups, the way the leaves form, will also affect the precipitation. The stickiness of the leaf, obviously very sticky leaves collect more, but it won't absorb it, it won't eat it, and the roots never sees them and never goes into the ground. And then that's the same for the next particle, whereby the PM. But when we get to 2.5s, it is so thin in the air that it's not going to be affected by the wind could go that way, but the particles can go that way. You know, it has its own way of traveling. But what it is that it will stick onto the leaves, and it will sit there until it rains. And then when it rains, it lands on the pavement and goes back in the air again. So it's really important, and sort of the PM 2.5s is it lands on a grill, you know, it lands on something where the water can go into the ground and take the particles into the ground and lock it in there. That is really important. And also, if it doesn't rain, like it hasn't rained for a while, it gets covered, the leaves, and then it can't take any more 2.5. So you have to get a hose pipe, start washing these trees if you want them back into action. The nitrogen dioxide, of course, it keeps flying through. The shapes of the leaves make no difference. But there is the absorption of the leaf, and here's something unknown, and it absorbs it, but we don't know what happens to it afterwards. I mean, I thought, well, so sure you do, and no, we don't actually. And sometimes it eats too much and vomits it out when the lights go down. So it gives it back into the street, and so people will get confused about this because it's giving off nitrogen dioxide. And people say, no, it isn't giving off nitrogen dioxide. In fact, what it's giving off are VOCs, and the VOCs react with the nitrogen dioxides and reduce the nitrogen dioxide. So you get all this stuff. Anyway, that's a whole subject. But it dies a death in winter if the leaves fall off the trees. It's not around. So, but where the air pollution is the worst is the winter. So a tree without leaves, we might as well forget the benefits of the leaves. And then, obviously, the nitrogen dioxide. And moving on to the microbes, and we'll get into more detail on this, and the soil. This is really important. So don't go off and plant a tree and then go off and put paving slabs over it, because if the air can't get down into the soil, it can't absorb anything. So, of course, the French, you see, typically you have grills around your base of your trees, and it's getting more common. So now we'll just look at the summation of the tree. The tree the PM 2.5s, it's really important above ground. I mean, I'm not saying that these don't take out nitrogen, but this is the primary engine room. That's simple. Then the nitrogen dioxide has to go through the ground and out again, and there are water-soluble gases which also go into the ground because you've got water, and they'll be absorbed. And it's really important, this air, and this happens naturally because this thing is sucking things out. You know, the sun hits it, it sucks nutrients up, and as it sucks, it draws air in. But if there's a paving slab or concrete, it's no use to anybody. The other thing is that we must protect our existing trees. I mean, they're going to chop down in Euston for temporary taxi ranks out for the HS2 outside Euston. They're going to take down those amazing plane trees on the filthiest road, and it's crazy. But you can't replace it, because this little one here, you know, this is 70 times more productive. So I've got to grow 70 of those to one of those. And okay, it may be knobbly and ugly, and yeah, but it's working. It's because the roots underground are working hard. The problems with these trees is it's very difficult to grow new roots because the ground's so compacted, so the tree can't grow, and if you don't get the roots, you don't get the production. So the production of those planes on the filthiest road of London, and you can fight it because legally speaking, they're not allowed to increase the air pollution on the filthy road of Euston, and by chopping those trees down, they will increase it. The other thing is the types of trees, and there's a beautiful tree, but this is a very productive tree, and then the ferns are not so productive as others. So there is a huge difference, and don't worry, there's only got 2 trees there. You've got loads of them, and you go on the internet, and I'll tell you which one. Sorry, I've done something terrible there. Right, and the other thing is, there is this thing of absorbing nitrogen dioxide during the day, and there is this issue of giving off gases at night, and that's, yes, it's part of the process. But we got street lighting and other things like that, so it's not absolutely dark versus bright. Now I'm going to remind you of all those awful days after your GCSEs. Maybe you've got a nephew or something, or niece is doing their GCSEs. But this is the nitrogen cycle. And it is really important because it is nature taking nitrogen out of the air, bringing it into the ground and processing it, and that becomes a food. But if I short-circuit it, the key thing is that nitrogen, the plant doesn't eat nitrogen. You can't eat nitrogen. It's got to eat nitrogen, nitrates, which is nitrogen trioxide. So it's got to have that now, and that's food. So, but to have that, first of all, what happens is the nitrogen comes along here, and it can get converted through microbes on the root straight into food into the plant. The next thing that happens is it's called nitrogen fixation through bacteria in the soil that converts the nitrogen to ammonia, that smelly stuff in your lab days, and that then is, through nitrification, forms nitrogen dioxide. And once you make nitrogen dioxide, it then can make nitrifying bacteria will make it into nitrates, and munch, it can eat it. So what we are talking about, our nitrogen dioxide, is here. We just thought short-circuiting, we have to go through all this process. So it's food. Thanks very much, Mr. Taxi Driver, because I can eat all this this pollution. I'm very happy, and more of it, please. So the formulas I've summarized here is saying it's not only one sort of process. The nitrogen is via lightning bolt bang, makes ammonia, and then then there's the process that makes the NO2, then NO3. The nitrogen fixation through the bacteria in the soil makes the NO2 that forms the food. And there is obviously the other aspect is nitrogen is dissolved in could make these on the leaves, but the other the nitrogen can be made directly into the NO3 through the microbes. But then I convert it back to the car, so we're not hurting the tree. We're not doing something nature doesn't want. It actually forms the process where we get the NO2 and nitrifying, then makes the NO3 the plant food. Nitrogen dioxide will dissolve in water, it forms nitric acid, and then nitric acid breaks down and makes the NO3. And then there is obviously the NO2 being absorbed directly by the leaves. Now, what weird, how come the engineers, they come along, oh, this is not good enough, come on, let's pump this stuff full of air. So we come along and we just pump air through the soil. Now, I take you to Victorian sewer work. That's what they used to do to stop the smell. It's nothing particularly new. But we're now developing fans to pump the air through the soil, and it's not as simple. You've got to look at the soil. You've got to make sure it's not compacted and how much energy you're using. But yes, we can actually, what was one tree now can process 50 trees, 60 trees, hundreds of trees, and so we're now pumping air through the roots of the trees. Sorry, 1 minute. That's and so where did you? So I said, well, you're not going to go off and plant a tree tomorrow and wait for it to grow. So all you've got to do. This is on the street. You get a fan. You go down a B&Q, get 2 window boxes, fill the bottom one with water, drill some holes in it, get a supply of air, from a fish tank, air supply. Bubble the air in, and it will go up through the roots and soil, and that will start cleaning the air where the person is. That's where you want it. The other one is you can basically, you've got a waterfall got a little pump here. The water goes up and it comes down through a grey medium where the plants are, and you supply air in here and you just blast it out through the roots. And this one's a fog. This is a spray. So you just got a mist, generate a mist here with the plant. All the roots love all that mist, and you pump the air in and it processes it. These sort of things, go down to B&Q, have a few beers and get your mates around and make one. But it will clean the air substantially more than a tree. And you can't wait for the tree to come. You need it tomorrow morning. That's a vertical, obviously planted. You could scale this up to any size. But similarly, this one is you're pumping air, and you basically bubble the air up through the water, and then it goes through. You've basically got clay balls in here, and then the plant grows from that, but it can be a tree. Just make it bigger. And then this other one's a trickly one where you pump air through here, but you trickle water down here, so it's having a constant shower. And then the last one is this aeroponics, where you spray the water underneath. The roots hang in an inverted shower. And again, you just simply blow the air through. And now we're moving on to very advanced work in working with algae and algae lamps that absorb, in the particular case, the CO2, but also algae will absorb everything, it just munches everything. You've got 200,000 algae to choose from. There's always going to be one that will like the pollution in that particular street. And then from that, you just put electrodes in and you can make electricity, and boom, you get a little light for nothing. Great, thank you very much.
Wow, there's a lot in there, and we can return to that in discussions. Our final speaker, Bill Watts, Senior Partner at Max Fordham, Environmental and Building Services Engineering. He studied zoology at Oxford and Stirling Universities before joining Max Fordham in 1980. Spent nearly 40 years designing environmental services installations. Bill has more recently been discussing the wider agenda of the energy and resource use in the UK, and particularly from the point of view of the building user. Bill apparently is the star of There Will Be Water, not a documentary I know, but it's out there somewhere, an interesting documentary charting his involvement in development of the Sahara Forest Project, which perhaps he can tell us a bit about. This scheme aims to provide fresh water, food and renewable energy in hot and arid regions such as the Sahara, as well as revegetating areas of uninhabited desert. And through some sort of strange serendipity, it turns out Bill, in fact, was very closely connected with a project upstairs in SuperMaterial, the one involving the concrete with the mosses and the lichens on. So hopefully we'll know more about that. So, Bill, over to you. Thank you.
All right. I've taken full advantage of being asked at the last minute to come and not preparing anything. So this will be, but I do have quite a bit to say about pollution in cities, and I will be revealing some of my pet ideas within that. I hope you don't mind. So just some of the things that were kindly mentioned. I'm a bit of a moss man myself. I do like moss. It's a wonderful material. It's incredibly tactile. You can stroke it, and it's great. And it does change. If it gets, you can change it from something completely grey to something completely verdant and green. It's fantastic by adding water to it. And indeed, I'm working with UCL Bartlett to make moss into an architectural feature, to try and change to up its PR from being a sort of something that needs to be pilloried and sprayed off and scraped into an artistic endeavour. Now, that's actually quite hard to do because moss doesn't grow on demand. It needs to go through its cycle. So it's fair to say that we're going through quite a bit of learning, which we might share some ideas with yourself on that. So the intention behind moss on walls was to try to make we've all seen green walls which cost an absolute fortune to install and even more to maintain. The intention is to make something that is zero maintenance, would just grow there naturally, but grow in a nice, graceful manner. And as part of, so the project is as much about architecture and making moss and what might happen to moss nice, as opposed to hated, which it quite often is. So moss, and indeed all plants, will absorb pollution, as we've heard, and it's great. There's a chap called Harith Pochi and Eleanor Hugo who did a project at Max Fordham's to look at the effectiveness of green infrastructure at dealing with a whole lot of things. I like the idea that nice mossy walls would reduce the noise in streets and things like that. Anyway, they looked at a number of different things. And the specific issue on pollution is that it will help, but it's a matter of 1% or 2%. Now, we can talk about that as to how much, but it's not a big thing. It's not a big thing. Now, titanium dioxide is something, I don't know if you know, but it's the main ingredient for self-cleaning glass. I really do. I want to touch on that and reinforce what was said about it. It is used a lot now in self-cleaning glass, and we've got a lot of glassy buildings in cities. It's used on concrete to keep it clean. It's a product of it's paint. It's used in paint to keep things white. Now, it's incredibly effective. It's a photo catalyst. And a colleague of mine who did a PhD on this about 10 years ago. And he found that it was very effective at reducing nitrates into nitrogen dioxide into nitric acid, which then ran down in rainwater and got rid of it. But if that gets into the air, and it will also produce, there's another product or species that comes from that process, the VOCs, which aren't very nice, and also ozone, which is fine when it's up, in the ozone layer, but when it's down at ground level, it is a quite effective toxin. All that's to say that the promise of self-cleaning concrete, self-cleaning glass that will get rid of nitrogen dioxide is true, but one needs to be careful what you wish for, but you might replace that with actually a more toxic gas. So we can talk about that if you like. So I'm sorry I'm being a bit of a miserable engineer to say that there aren't any magic bullets, but actually we should be not chucking so much nitrogen dioxide in the air in the first place. Now, that's easier said than done, perhaps. The biggest culprit is the internal combustion engine. I mean, basically, you must stop. Try not to burn stuff in cities. It's a dumb idea, and it produces a lot of. It produces CO2, which is one thing, but it also produces a whole lot of other things, like nitrogen dioxide, which you don't really want. Now, setting aside, transport is interesting, and I think it probably doesn't have so much to do with the built environment, but it does a bit. How we engineer our buildings does affect how much the need for transport is there. But I mean, just the narrow issue of getting rid of diesels, one can see how one could do that is you can transfer a diesel you can make a diesel into a spark ignition gas engine. I think you can just transfer that over. In Dhaka and in Delhi, they said all the tuk-tuks, which were two-stroke, they said, right, we're not going to sell you any two-stroke anymore. You've got to go into compressed natural gas. And that happened overnight. And their pollution levels, went down substantially, just like that. There's no mucking about, no consultation with these poor tuk-tuk drivers. And all of a sudden, they didn't have any fuel. There was huge queues. But now they're all on CNG. And it's a much cleaner air because they said, right, you guys, we're just going to do this. So can you imagine that happening to the taxi drivers in London, saying, I'm sorry, you can't drive around in diesel anymore, you've got to be on compressed natural gas? Well, I think it'll be useful, interesting exercise. But one can see how the electrification and self-driving cars are just going to completely revolutionize our transport system. Anyway, that's not to do with the built environment. I'm a building services engineer, and actually you start off by learning how to heat a building. That's what we do. And the heating of the buildings is the other half of the source of pollution in London and the nitrogen dioxide. And basically, we need to try and use less energy to heat our buildings. Now, I'm sorry, that's a bit of a boring thing to say, but it works. If you burn less, there's less pollution. Now, you can use advanced materials to do that, and the retrofit of the built environment is something that is, I'm sure there are subjects here, new insulation systems that are small and dealing with moisture and things like that. These are all challenges that would need to be faced to reduce the need for burning stuff and heating our buildings. The other things that, and this is getting onto a hobby horse of mine, is that we're in fact, the legislation and the planning guidelines are encouraging us to burn more stuff. The CHP is a more or less a requirement of the planning regulations, and CHP, which is combined heat and power, and I guess everybody knows what that is as the electricity supply becomes more provided by wind, PV, nuclear, even gas-fired power stations. The small CHP engine that you've been forced to put in your block of flats or anything like that will be the dirtiest form of electricity in the country. And yet we are being forced to put it in now. The district heating systems, where you're just burning gas to supply that, have got losses associated with them of 50%. You might be lucky and get it down to 20%. That means you're burning that much more gas than you would do if you were doing it in your dwelling or home like that. So I've slipped in my hobby horse, which is about CHP and district heating, but it is relevant because the less you burn, the less pollution you're going to make, and the CO2 issue is reduced. And you've got less of a problem to start with. Clearly, incinerating stuff in the middle of a city is it's difficult to see how that's a good idea, given the pollution overlay that we've got at the moment. So, some people might say, well, okay, so how are you? You do still need to provide some heat for buildings. I mean, this is a pitch for going for either cleaner. Gas in itself is actually quite a clean fuel, and the boilers are getting better, and we can move into fuel cells and things like that as an upgrade cycle. But actually, we're probably going to become electric. You might say, well, okay, where's that electricity going to come from? If it is a gas-fired power station, don't put that gas-fired station, which will have NOx emissions, don't put it in the middle of a city where a lot of people live. If it's got pollution, try and move it away from where where all your people are. And also, there are other sources of electricity, as I said, wind and solar. I mean, with another hat on, I'm working in desert areas, making electricity from the sun, and also growing vegetables in greenhouses. I mean, it's really interesting seeing the world through that perspective, because actually we need more CO2 in those greenhouses. We like increased CO2 levels. We squirt. Commercial greenhouses try to lift the concentration of CO2 from 400 parts per million up to 1,000, something like that. The productivity of the photosynthetic cycle will go up as the concentration of CO2 goes up. So that's one thing that is interesting to observe. But carbon is a resource in that sense. The other thing is the cost of PV, the electricity from PV, is just flying down. There are the cost, people are selling electricity from a PV installation, albeit in the Atacama Desert, which is a bit far away, for $3 a kilowatt hour. I don't know what that would, but that's about 2 pence a kilowatt hour. Now that's okay. That's a long way away, but that's now, and they haven't finished reducing the cost of all of that. So I can see, if one's talking about a future that doesn't have pollution, I think there is a future, and I like it, that is solar, which is either having solar panels in the country that you're in and then storing it, and the cost of storage is coming down as well, or by having solar and wind all over the place and then having a network of power cables around the world. I don't see that as being too far-fetched. I think it's happening very quickly as we speak. So coming back on message as to what new materials there are to reduce pollution, I would rephrase the question that we should try and avoid putting the pollution there in the first place, and either by insulating our houses or doing things like that, and also producing our energy from greener, less polluting systems. And there's nothing controversial in that, I'm sorry to say. But I think that's what we need to do. Thank you. That's all I've got to say.
Could all three speakers take a seat on the panel, please? So we're going to move to some questions, and I'll kick one off. I just want to get it really simple, and in this week of general election and cheap electioneering sort of tactics, why don't we do that here? So let's pretend I'm going to bump into Sadiq Khan sometime soon, and he's going to ask me for a top tip. What can I tell him that might encourage him to think he should come up with a really clear, simple message that's going to be a vote winner, that's actually going to get people feeling that he can give another $1 billion to dealing with this issue? What would you, one thing that you could really do that would actually be a kind of a near-term, meaningful action, but sort of, a priority? What could we do? Because you both, or all three, kind of lots of ideas, lots of understanding, but of course it is very complicated. You do this, and there's some toxin created over there, or you do this, but it takes a long time, or you do this, but it's actually not very, it's right sort of systemic change feeding through. Starting with Johnny.
Well, I talked a little bit about plasma chemistry, and it's still fairly new. A lot of people will know that we were world leaders in making chips for mobile phones, and the company got sold to a Japanese bank. We actually developed carbon fiber in this country at Farnborough, and then gave it to the Americans, and the Americans developed it and turned it into composites. So my answer to that question would be that we should become the global leaders in plasma chemistry to do the kind of things that you can do to crack methane. So if you wanted to investing in those people who are developing that science would be my answer.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm dreading months of talk about politics, but there's just simply not enough conversation about innovation, and and I think there is a balance between overseas aid and innovation. 93% of all the buildings going to be built are going to be in the developing world, not here. We just can't. Do we want them to make our mistakes? So I think, and we got to show they can't afford it. So I think the other thing is we have a wealth of. I think overseas aid is 13 billion a year, where the total income generated by architecture for the whole of the UK is 1.3 billion. So what I think is that if you imagine if London could not just talk about the physical product, it's the process of design and the health and well-being. It's not about pollution, and it's multifaceted, and be able to export that knowledge to the developing world that will still pay for that work, but they can't pay the total sum of it. But if UK can say, well, it's not selling one little widget, we're going to sell billions of widgets, and then it's worth the investment. So somehow I think there needs to be, London is an export business, and it isn't just about finance. And I think the design professions in the UK should not be allowed to go into recession and lose. They need to be booming with innovation to export to the developing world, with a link with overseas aid in a meaningful manner to make people's lives.
So invest in innovation, and then we end up actually getting a return on that by sorting out some environmental disasters happening in India and other places. Back.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to my bee in my bonnet, which is to stop putting bloody CHP everywhere. And that, as a stroke, would get rid of a lot of problems. Put that money.
I'm big on it. Are we doing a lot of this? Are we encouraging this to happen more and more, and it's the wrong direction?
Yep. Who's an architect here? Who's had to put in a CHP plant? Who knows what the hell it does? Great. I think it's a real bit of, it's an interesting area where industry has been complicit in pushing something which it knew wasn't working, and being
so could Sadiq Khan just say, we're not going to have any of those in London, thank you very much, end of that.
And the other thing is, turn all the taxis and these buses into constant CNG.
So if we traded off with the taxi drivers, that they could have to do that, but we'll stop Uber at the same time, that might be a good trade-off.
Yeah.
Well, I think Uber, it's just amazing, isn't it? Poor old taxi drivers. I mean, if Uber doesn't get them, electric, self-driving cars.
The other bit we could help is by simply implementing the building regulations. The building regulations limits the amount of nitrogen dioxide allowed in a building. End of. You can't occupy that building. You can't occupy a building that hasn't got fire extinguishers. If you've got Putney High Street, the nitrogen dioxide levels are around 120 at the street level. If you go right to the top flat outside their window, it's 90. The limit's 40. They open their window. It's heavy. It'll stay in there. So I think we should immediately implement the building regulations, then follow that through. People then put in the filters to remove it. They will then return good air back to the street, and immediately the buildings can treat nitrogen dioxide far greater than, more than if the whole of the building was covered in trees. So I think I'd say there's two things. There's a long-term attitude, there's an immediate attitude of solve the problem immediately and send the bill to VW.
But that's an interesting point. That will cost money, filtering the air. Yeah. Why isn't that being done right now with the car manufacturers? Right now, there are solutions to that, in a way that Delhi did for their tuk-tuks. So telling the diesel car drivers that they need to transfer their assets into a clean fuel source is politically difficult. But if that was associated with some money to do that, it would be which filtering the air, if it's going to have a really big effect, will be expensive.
But so fire extinguishers, we're talking about £50 a person, and we're talking about 10,000 people dying a year. It's just if you read the Sunday Times reported, get ready for the lawsuits. They're going to, and it's coming through health executives, that people who are driving taxis will be suing their employers. Policemen will be suing their employers, and it's growing. I think the money we're talking about of putting filters in buildings is insignificant. I do agree we've got to solve the problem, but it's a bit like we have to have an immediate answer today. And buildings we spend 80% of our time in need to be safe havens. A school should have the best air in the world, if not the worst air in the world.
Can I just come back to the...
I don't want to sort of fixate on it, but actually, when you start adding it together, there's so many different things connected. You could make this quite a political, not just a green party type thing. It's sort of there could be industries attached to this, and you're basically, are you against diesel drivers, or are you against the various kind of causes that are attached to this? I'm wondering how we join it up and get the majority or at least the powerful group. So.
Can I come back to the significance of cracking methane to produce hydrogen? Because one of the issues, if you want to move to hydrogen vehicles, and that is one of the options, one of the issues is that we don't have a hydrogen distribution network. So we don't have an infrastructure, and you can't just plug in hydrogen anywhere you go. But we have gas mains in every single town which produce methane. Now, the plasma cracking technology is compact. You can put it in a 40-foot container, which means that you can simply put a container, a 40-foot container where you now have a petrol station or a diesel station, plug it into the gas main, and out of the methane you can then generate hydrogen. So we do actually have a hydrogen infrastructure. It's just that it comes around the country in the form of methane. That means that we could actually transform to hydrogen-powered vehicles. As fuel cell technology improves, as I say, storage improves, we could move quite quickly to a hydrogen infrastructure for vehicles. Let's say the exhaust gases from that is water vapor, it's H2O. That's what comes out of the exhaust. You can put a glass under it and drink it.
So you need to find some very green local authority that kind of converts a sort of trial area to work in that way, or?
Where we're starting is actually, I showed you a picture of the oil sands in Canada. Where we're starting is with the oil companies who pay a vast carbon tax to burn off that methane. Actually, what we can do is take the boxes to the oil sands. You then plug the methane into the box, and what you get is hydrogen, which you can use as an energy source. You end up with vast amounts of graphene, which means that everybody in this room will be able to have good access to cheap and plentiful graphene at some point, because it'll simply be a byproduct of our energy infrastructure.
We're going to go to some questions here now. There's a question. Yeah. Wait for the wait for the microphone, then we can all hear questions.
Sorry. I think mine was less of a question. It was your comment regarding CHP. Now, the GLA energy plan is up for review in the next year. And I went to a lecture about 2 weeks ago. Now, there's Elementa, who are M&E engineers, that are already in the process of trying to get architects, other engineers, anybody within sustainability, to speak to the government to try and get it addressed, so that there's less emphasis being put on CHP going forward, because currently it's very much pushed.
Yeah, thank you.
Next question. There's one behind.
Hi, I'm also a boring engineer, so I like innovation, but I love data even more. So it's three comments actually. On trees, there are very good resources and models such as iTree that actually are quite robust, that are about to be adopted by the Forestry Commission, and which take on balance the effects on various pollutants, including VOCs, and in some cases, we have to be honest, that actually has a negative effect, and it could contribute to ozone creation locally. Questions on graphene. Could you tell us more about these claims around shielding electromagnetic fields? Because I understood that was actually quite difficult to do, and also about your microwave idea.
It's not an idea, it's real. I mean, in terms of, because graphene is a superconductor, if you paint a wall with graphene, I mean, often in producing an electromagnetic shield paint, they use graphite and graphene. You use a mix of that. But effectively, it's like, I mean, the same way that if you covered your walls in copper, then it would be like a Faraday cage. So if you cover your wall in a conductor, effectively it becomes a Faraday cage, and that stops electromagnetic radiation coming in. There are a range of products on the market that do that. Some are more or less effective. But, I mean, sorry, go on.
Would that be at all times? Because I understood that what we're worried about, you mentioned children's bedrooms, is
Yeah.
Wi-Fi, and that is
Yeah, I mean, when you say at all times, yes, once you've put it on the wall and you've earthed it effectively, made a connection to the earth, then effectively it acts as a screen. But I mean, again, these are technologies which are developing. I mean, we haven't talked much about paint, and let me just talk a little bit more about paint, because I mean, one of the big pollutants are the chemical paints we put on our walls. They're full of VOCs. You paint them, you've only got to smell them. We tried graphenstone paints at home and painted the very first rooms we did. You went in a short while afterwards. There was no smell of paint. Those paints absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So, I mean, you could all be making a contribution simply by buying Patrick's paint. But so, I mean, I think that's the thing about the new materials, that they are, people are thinking about these things in terms of how do we reverse some of the processes. For years, we've made paint out of acrylics and chemicals and all sorts of nasty things. And we all know what a newly painted room smells like, and it's not pleasant. If you're painting your child's bedroom, you don't want the child to sleep in there for 3 or 4 days until the smell's clear. Well, that's not acceptable. And we don't have to do that anymore. We've got coatings that avoid all that problem. I mean, just coming back to, you had another question about the microwaves. I mean, just on that, a lot of plasma science requires high pressures and very high temperatures. But the latest in this plasma chemistry that I'm talking about literally takes, you have a reactor, you have 2 waveguides, and you have microwaves coming in on either side, which meet at a point, and you have a nozzle which injects the methane into that flow of microwaves. And the microwaves turn the methane into a plasma. The hydrogen just is given off. The graphene in very pure small platelets, sort of microplatelets, just filters out. The other ways of making graphene at the moment, there's exfoliation of graphite. You have to start with pure graphite. Effectively, you cook it, and peel off layers. That's a messy process. There's chemical vapor deposition, which is another way of doing it, where you need catalysts, and you need a layer that you deposit the graphene onto, usually copper, which means you've got to scrape it off. And when it settles, it's lumpy and bumpy, and it's not very pure. This method, this new chemistry, literally produces absolutely pure graphene. And plasma chemistry has been around for a while. The world doesn't have very many experts in it. A lot of it's been focused on, as I say, attempts at nuclear fusion. And the reactor I talked about at Culham takes more energy than it produces. So we haven't cracked that problem. But there are other ways in which you can use plasma chemistry. It's alchemy. I mean, essentially what you do is take a molecule of methane and break it apart and then rebuild it as anything you want. So using the same chemistry, you can build acetylene out of methane molecules. So it is 21st century alchemy. And that's why I say that there's so much you can do with this new area of science. That's why I go back to my original point. It would be great if we could dominate that science here in this country and produce these different uses, because the benefits are so obvious in terms of, let's say, the ability to put in a hydrogen infrastructure, the materials that we're producing, that you start producing graphene with so many different uses at increasingly low cost.
Yeah. Just picking up on the bit about the trees and things, and it's a really bizarre that you've got to be so careful with research work that yes, they do give off Vocs, but they immediately react with nitrogen dioxides, which actually so it's a bit like someone just wants to end a story where at the end they want to be giving and you don't continue going. It's a very, very complicated aspect using vegetation. However, the basic chemistry is very simple, but the other aspect is where all our local authorities are updating their air quality action plans. It's everybody should be contributing to it, and you can actually contribute to local authorities you don't have nothing to do with. It's a really important document, and it doesn't. And the other thing is environmental impact assessments, and doing air quality impact assessments, which are nonsense. I do them. They're nonsense. I can get you. If you want planning, I'll get you planning. They're nonsense, but there's huge liability with those things. So I think people have got to be very careful. So I think there, and I think it's like the CHP problem. You know, somebody thought it was a good idea, and it was a stupid idea. It's like diesel cars, another stupid idea. It's a very simple. Somebody solves one problem, but they don't understand it actually creates many other problems. But certainly, I think the air quality action plans should, and in that. And NICE have just done their guidance, and there's all these other guidance, and it says that when a developer does a block of flats in Wimbledon, does 100 blocks of flats, he has to write out a cheque of £2.5 million to the local authorities. 15% of that can be spent by local community to make environmental improvements in their neighbourhood, okay? And they can spend that money on what they see as an environmental improvement. The only problem with vegetation, there's no scientific evidence. Right? So they go, what do you mean there's no science? Well, you got this report, you got that. Well, the thing is, it links very quickly, and the very good work done by UCL links it to health and well-being and people going mad without trees, you know, an obvious thing. So as soon as it adds that, there's huge financial gains. So what also it's manageable by community. They can understand growing things. And why can't I grow tomatoes in my road because it's filthy air? You know, why shouldn't I? I should be able to. And so I think what's coming is one is we need to be more proactive in the air quality action plans and expect that vegetation is part of that in a meaningful manner. And proper guidance says these are the types of trees you should use of X, Y, and Z. The other aspects is no environmental air quality impact assessments will consider anything to do with vegetation. It is zero value because they have no mathematical, because the EU doesn't have a mathematical way of approving this tree will remove this levels of pollution, which is a shame. And therefore, quite understandably why a developer says, well, I want to pay this money for these trees. You know, there's no gain, you know, why should I? So I think there is some fundamental challenges where we can lead, and I think London should lead. It should say, there's the proper way of doing an environmental air quality impact assessment done properly, which does include Ubers, that presently an air quality impact doesn't include Ubers, it doesn't include home deliveries in any assessment. Here's a proper document that really makes sense, and here is an air quality action plan that helps the community, and it looks after the money, and the development goes into this, and the money is going to be spent on this, and it will do environmental improvements, and the local community can spend that money. It's their money, and they should spend it on planting trees and green spaces and growing, food and things. As the system, then you can export that because it makes sense, because it's a win-win. It's a win-win solution. The healthier people, increased values, you name it, it's all in there. So I think if that's what we are very good at exporting, as well as great innovation, and I don't mind we sell it off to the Americans. We'll come up with something else. It's great. I think let's keep selling them because I think that I'm an engineer and I value innovation, but we're a small country. If you've got to go to some global players that will take that innovation, it generates that, and then we follow through it gets money back in, and people can keep innovating. That's my.
Let's just have some more questions, and keep the questions quite short because I've got quite a few questions. Keep our answers short, and then we'll get through them. I think you're next. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to top tips for Sadiq Khan. Now, I imagine air quality around schools is something that will be on his agenda. What are 2 or 3 things you would advise him to do there?
Well, we're now putting carbon filters on, as a matter of course, onto the air intakes to schools, because that's what we find is going to be required, and it means that that natural ventilation is somewhat. It means you've got a full mechanical ventilation system. Opening the windows is problematic, which it quite often is anyway in a school. I mean, it's driving you down a particular line. I mean, it's interesting. We're going through the same thing for a school talking about export in Dhaka, which is weird doing a school in Dhaka, but that we are filtering the air. We put this sort of cocoon around the outside because the air is pretty bad, and the air going in is carbon filtered. So just doing.
What do they do in the playground? How do they breathe then?
Well, what we were doing is creating this sort of barrier around the outside, and then the playgrounds are in the middle under a bit of a tent, and the air cascades out the classrooms, and we're sort of trying to encouraging it towards the central facility, so they sort of get second-hand air from the classroom in this rather hopeful manner that they will benefit from it. But the cricket pitch outside, well, you can't do that.
Any other answers to that question?
I mean, paint, it's really easy. I mean, for your nitrous oxides, Graphene does a paint that uses the same photocatalytic process to take the nitrogen dioxide out of the air. Stop using nasty plastic acrylic paints full of VOCs and start using natural paints, green paints, and that's what Graphene specialise in. And these are paints that will absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So these things, there are materials now which we used to think of as being inert. You put them on the wall and they just stayed there. Now these things are active. They're taking nitrogen dioxide out, they're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and so on. So just repaint all the schools.
But there's in London, there's 1,200 schools that are all polluted. The air's. There is evidence now, just coming out of King's College, we're launching the latest 5-year research that kids in air pollution, their lungs are 10% smaller. So why don't you go and chop their fingers off next? It's ludicrous. And I have to give full credit to London Sustainable Exchange, which has been working hard on this for the last 5-10 years. And what they do is they start with the kids, they do the measurements, then they bring in the mum and dad. Don't drive me to school anymore. It is very good work. However, they've got to have an immediate solution. And I'm sure if LSX were here now, they'll say, why aren't they doing it? Why? Got no money, got no money, got no money. There is money being released by the government onto environmental improvements to schools, and it's just about diverting. I look forward to the first teacher to sue the school for putting them in a working environment that doesn't meet the building regs. As soon as you've got that case settled, every school will they'll find the money, they'll implement it. But it is an absolute disgrace that we could ever impose any, with that knowledge. It's the next asbestos. And the only reason we dropped asbestos because people got sued. And I'm sorry, I don't want to bring in lawyers, but it is a lawyer-led problem.
Okay, good. Take one question there, then we come back over here. Okay.
Hi, my name is Raymond Oliver. I'm Professor of Advanced Functional Materials in Newcastle. And if I was an architect, I'd be really disappointed and worried about what you're talking about. Because anything that's going to relate to how do you take a component out of air is a mass transfer process. So you have a rate constant, you have a surface area, and you have a concentration gradient. Now, if you take graphene, or if you take algae, what you need to know is how is it affecting the rate constants before you do, and you can do those calculations, which then allow you to say, are these viable as alternative ways of helping to reduce pollution? Now, if you take something like graphene, there's no such thing as graphene going to be used on its own. It's going to be either in the form of an ink or it's going to be in a composite. As soon as it's in a composite, it loses a lot of its properties. When it's in an ink, if it's a solvent-based ink, you're creating more pollution than you ever generate, you're trying to lose. I think the algae question is really interesting. If you can get to grips with algae and trees, how much area can you create? And can you affect the rate constant? Because if you can create, excuse me, the area and affect the rate constant, you can reduce the pollutants in the atmosphere. So this idea of radical materials has got a long way to go before you take a radical material like graphene and think that's the answer to everything. I mean, I would ask the question about graphene, what can't it do? Because you think what you tried to point out was it can do everything, and of course it can't. But the key here is it's quite simple. You get right back to the basics. There's a transfer coefficient, a rate coefficient, there's a surface area, and there's a concentration gradient. And when you get that optimized with different types of materials, you can make inroads in practical terms, in architectural terms, on how you could apply that onto surfaces and onto walls. Okay, sorry.
Perhaps Charlie, come back.
To be honest, my hearing's not brilliant, and I missed some of that. But I mean, you're talking in terms of how you get graphene from the present stage of a sort of wonder material that can do everything, actually to doing things useful. I mean, I think part of that is going to be around making graphene available at much lower prices and much more plentifully, so that people can take it away and experiment with it and produce uses for it. It's one of the things that we do at Cambridge Nanosystems, where we work on composites and we work on polymers. And just to give you an example, we're talking about photovoltaic cells. Graphene won't help you generate electricity, but because it's a very good thermal conductor, if you include it, you get a very even distribution of heat. It also means that if you're in bright sunlight, your photovoltaic cells don't overheat, so you can actually manage the heat much better. You're absolutely right. Graphene is going to be an additive. It's going to enhance the property of things that we already have. But coming back to the built environment, if you look at some of the additives that are being developed for concretes and other building materials, these are going to be very light and very strong. In terms of the amount of material they use, that will be down significantly. So we'll be able to build much more efficiently. We'll be able to build lighter and stronger structures and use less material in the process. But you're absolutely right. It is an additive. It's not a self-contained material in itself. You put it in other things and it changes the properties. And I gave the example of car tires. That's how we're going to see graphene emerging in the environment.
I'd like to ask a question rather than just because quite a lot of questions out here. So you're in the red top there.
How do we know it's not the next? How do we know it's not the next asbestos? Have we checked the impact on human health and
yes.
in longer term exposure? It's not just the production of it and what it recycles to be produced, but also its effect on
it has been
human
very
health.
thoroughly tested because it comes in different sizes. So you can get it 1 micron up to 5 microns. If you get larger platelets of it, it could be potentially toxic. So in producing graphene, you make sure it's in very, very small particles, and that avoids that. As a substance, it's completely inert, so it's not toxic in any way at all. It can be airborne, absolutely, because in the platelet form, it can be a very fine dust, but they've done exhaustive tests on whether that is potentially toxic. I say it's entirely to do with the size of the platelets. If you keep them small, they're not toxic.
I'm going to take a question here. I know you're probably again thinking it's time to head off, but one more question, and then we'll have a little wrap up.
So my question is very simple. Related to algae, do you share this information? Because I was at a presentation by Arabs a few weeks ago, and they're developing similar technology, and I'm just wondering, do people share this information? Because it seems like people are just working in individual silos, you know, and it would be much more beneficial, you know, with sharing of information.
There is, yeah, it's a fantastic website for algae. You just go to algae, and there's a big promotion of algae and every type of thing you want to know about algae. So I think it is interesting, I was picking up also the comment, is engineers are participating with nature because we get that technology proven only by pumping it. We drive it. So when I wanted to include it, planting a tree in the ground says this, it could work, it may do, there's a small percentage increase. But no, yeah, of course it is, but I'm getting 100 times more output because I've engineered it. I've engineered the planter it sits in. I'm using hydroponics. We're pumping, we're using nature. Some people are saying being very cruel, but it's like a fit horse or something, you know, we're just, you know, and these are really important things. Yes, there are brilliant innovation. And the comment that was made by the gentleman there is really right. It's about surface contact of algae. How do you get the air to contact? Because it's very, you could invent something. You know, you could invent something. All it is, it's not like you know anything about algae. It's how do you get the air that's polluted in contact with the surface? There's many ways. We're at some of the things I can't talk about, unfortunately, because they're under developing for patents. But anybody can think of it. So you don't need to be an algae specialist or an air quality specialist. So what you've got to be is, how do I get a surface, air, touch that surface? Because once it's touched, 5 seconds, it's done its job. It doesn't need to hang around. And so you can experiment these in the bath, you know what I mean? And I think that's where the innovation is going to come from. It's very simple. How do you get polluted air in contact? The other aspect, how do you get in contact from the exhaust pipe before it hits the mouth or the nose of the person? And that's the next challenge. So there's a very good competition out there now, Croydon. Enter just one A4 sheet for a streetscape. You get a £3 million commission out of it, designing the streets, which is, Croydon is very hot in air pollution. So there is stuff out there, but if you can get, by a competition, gather people around the table. This first phase of the competition is just to gather your team, and you just enter with your team, and then competitions are really good, like this recent one, at night. At night, the trees give off all these problems. How are we going to solve that at night? You know, so use competitions, because then people will come out with their information. They want to apply their information to something. I don't think you just could talk about an abstract. But yes, there's very good sites, and secondly, I think the other aspects that, don't worry, out of the systems that are out there doing algae, there'd be 10,000 and there'd be 9,000 load of rubbish. They don't work. Well, if you never made a mistake, you never made anything. So just because they didn't work doesn't mean the other 1,000 are not worth doing. And this is the important thing, is that we're learning and we then build on the successes, but not say, oh, it doesn't work, therefore it's not worth pursuing. I think that's the other aspect. And know how to make patterns very quickly.
Bill, did you want to come in on the algae as well?
I think I agree. I'm not working so much on algae. I mean, we have done some work on algae, and it's interesting to compare the people in the algae field and the people in the horticulture field who are growing tomatoes. And the algae field can be very like that, because they see mega bucks with, we're going to solve everything. I mean, this is on the fuel side, you know, replacing gasoline with algae. Whereas all the Dutch guys, they're naturally very open, and they share everything. And, you know, there are very few secrets. And it's really interesting seeing that difference. But actually, growing a tomato is profitable in its own right. Whereas growing algae, you're generating IP quite often. And that's not the same thing. And it does lead to a slight difference. But I don't think that's my experience of it, but I don't know.
Okay, well, I think it's probably time that we pulled things together and said thank you very much to our speakers. So, Charlie, Chris,
Thank you. Thank you.
A big thank you to all of you for coming to the talk, and I hope that some of you can make it to next week's talk and final one in the series. So, thank you.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.